You're listening to a Thames Estuary Partnership podcast, celebrating London's famous tidal river. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello, I'm Eve Sanders and I'm the Estuary Edges Officer at the Thames Estuary Partnership. Now, like many others, due to the COVID-19 situation, I am currently working from my home bedroom office, which certainly hasn't been without its challenges. But today I'm joined by Chris Baines, environmentalist, naturalist and gardener. He's joining me from his home in Wolverhampton. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's a real honour to be chatting to you.
It's a pleasure.
For our first podcast here today, we are going to be talking about species migration and the Thames Estuary, and really what the Thames means for species migration. But we're not just going to be talking about birds, which is the obvious thing that comes to mind when talking about migration. We're going to be covering the smaller insects, the moths and butterflies that use the Thames, all the way down to fish in the river and the smaller critters that live in the river. Chris certainly knows his stuff about this, so it's going to be really fascinating for me too. I'm definitely more of a twitcher, but I'm really keen to know more about what uses the Thames. Before we get into our main topic, Chris, I'd really like to start with you. Can you just tell me a bit about how you got into working with the natural world and what inspired you?
I grew up right in the middle of England in Sheffield, but I had parents who were both really keen on nature and walking, and grew up close to the edge of the Peak District. So my early life was spent being dragged through the heather across the moorlands, or helping my mum to grow plants. So my background really was a pretty good start to having a lifetime of interest in the environment. But I got particularly interested in the urban environment because I worked, after I left university, I studied horticulture and then landscape architecture, but I worked in inner city housing, particularly in difficult housing areas, Brixton, Hackney, Deptford, places in the Midlands, Liverpool, Toxteth, all these grim places. There was a period when everywhere I worked, there seemed to be riots. And that was really because I was working with problem communities with lots of difficulties. And what became very clear to me was that contact with nature made a difference to people's lives, and that actually that needed to be the nature where you lived or worked. And that, I think, has really shaped everything I've done since, really. So I'm passionate about the importance of nature, its value to people in their daily lives, and therefore to helping to make a stronger connection with nature for people wherever they live. So I've been very involved in promoting the whole idea of wildlife gardening for 40 odd years. Made the very first wildlife garden at Chelsea Flower Show, which was a bit of a revolution for the Royal Horticultural Society.
It's fantastic, yeah.
Only ever thought of wildlife in gardens as weeds and pests and diseases until then. And that's really, I suppose, what drew me to the Thames Estuary and that great strand of nature through the heart of the capital city. It's so obvious, really, when you look at a Google map of the city. There is this great ribbon of life flowing through the city, but actually, I know from working in those difficult housing areas, there are many, many people who live there who've never seen the Thames, let alone have the idea that there might be harbour porpoises and seals living in it, or fish below the surface. So forging that stronger sense of an involvement with the natural world right there on the doorstep, I think, is something which is really important and something that I enjoy doing.
Fantastic. I mean, I know that is a really big issue, isn't it? It's this kind of lack of communication between what's happening on the Thames and what species are living in the Thames, and then there's these communities living close by that have no idea. So it's connecting those two. I mean, that must have been such a fascinating area of work.
It's easy to see why people don't automatically understand it. You stand on one of the bridges in the middle of the city and you look at the water and it looks dirty and brown, and it's difficult to believe there's anything living in it until a cormorant pops up, and that gives you a bit of clue that if there's, well, to you or to me, that gives us a bit of a clue that if there's a cormorant there must be some fish, but you can't see them. So it's not intuitive, really, to look at the Thames and think, well, it's full of life, particularly in that central part that so many millions of people see. I think it's a bit easier to understand when you get further downriver and you see big areas of mud flats and salt marsh and great flocks of birds. So not surprising, really, that people wouldn't automatically make that connection. And to be fair, for a couple of centuries, really, the city turned its back on the river anyway. And that's true of most urban rivers throughout the world, certainly in this country, that for a very long time they were seen as the place to dump rubbish, and they weren't very pleasant, and so why would you face them? And it's really only in the last 30, 40, 50 years that the idea of a riverside dwelling or an office overlooking the Thames is something to aspire to. So the Thames has been the edge of people's lives, I think, for all of my life. And I think that's been part of the challenge for the Thames Estuary Partnership, that actually there are something like, I think it's 16 different local authorities that have an edge of the Thames, but it's always the edge. You know, it's always the margin. And I suppose what the Thames Estuary Partnership has been trying to do for 20 odd years now is to put the Thames Estuary at the heart of the city rather than at the edge of communities. And I think we're winning. I think people are beginning to see it as a centerpiece for the city.
I couldn't agree more. And that comes in, you know, coming into that also is kind of changing people's perceptions and changing their mindset from looking at it and thinking, okay, it's brown, it's dirty, you know, it's a river, it's got all of this kind of pollution in it, and to actually changing that to, well, it's supposed to be brown, it's an estuary, it's got suspended sediment in it.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of golden question, is how you change people's views on that, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think we do now have the technology, for instance, to show people what's living under the water in a way that was difficult. I mean, you had to go to the zoo and visit the aquarium to see the fish, whereas we actually could now be showing people. There could be screens at every river taxi boarding point that show you what's living underneath the boardwalk that you're walking on. I think there are ways in which we could bring the hidden aspects of the Thames Estuary into people's lives even more. But for the most part, I think just being persuasive, really, actually giving people the lists, the evidence, the names of the species, the surprising things, you know, the 120 odd different species of fish that are now living in the Thames, when 60, 70 years ago there were none. That's an extraordinary kind of change. And there's no doubt that as soon as you start to say to people, well, did you know that there are harbour porpoises, small whales effectively, that actually swim past the House of Commons? That comes as such a surprise to people because, you know, most people don't see them. There are otters that travel all the way up through the city. So I think being persuasive on the basis of the science, if you like, the evidence that we have, is part of what I hope we can do. I do think that the Kinks have a lot to, can take a lot of the blame. The whole, you know, the Waterloo Sunset is such an iconic song, and that whole business of dirty old river is firmly embedded in the national psyche, and I think they owe us some support at the Thames Estuary Partnership. I think we should maybe siphon off just a little of the millions that must have been made by that song, which is casting aspersions at our favourite estuary.
Maybe that could be our next project, to raise some funds for making a new song with new lyrics.
Sparkling River, yeah.
You never know. What's your kind of favourite spot from around the Thames, and is there a species that you've seen on the Thames that really has stayed with you?
I've got two favourite spots, actually. One which isn't really to do with wildlife, and that's Leigh-on-Sea, which is, I think, just an extraordinary little time warp for people who don't know it, to be able to get on a train in the middle of London and get off into Dickens' London, really. This glorious little fishing port with the whelk stores and the jellied eels and all the rest of it. I love that. And I was lucky enough to travel out with one of the cockle fishing boats from there. So there is wildlife out in the Maplin Sands beyond there, which is feeding the whole ecosystem. One of the really striking things that I remember was I worked in Barking for quite a while, and the shoreline there, which is great stretches of sandy beach and mud, fantastic numbers of shelduck. And shelduck are really beautiful ducks. and they build their nests in old rabbit holes, so they're quite interesting.
Wow.
And their ducklings are fantastic little black and white stripy things, look like humbugs, you know. And that when I first saw the numbers there really surprised me. But actually, it shouldn't have surprised me, because there are more and more places up and down the Thames where not just the quality of wildlife, but the quantity of wildlife is really extraordinary, I think. And obviously, the further out you go, the further downstream you go, the wilder it gets. But I remember watching a cormorant right by the House of Commons struggling with a very sizable eel that it was trying to swallow. To have that with the backdrop of Big Ben is pretty extraordinary. And I suspect most of the people walking over Westminster Bridge didn't notice. But I did. I was captivated for 15 minutes until eventually it managed to swallow this poor eel. And I think one of the other things which is very unglamorous, but a really interesting part of the Thames Estuary's wildlife, is the plants that are growing on the river walls. There are lots of plants growing along the edge of the estuary that have come from all over the world. And so biologically, botanically, the detail in those elements of the estuary I find fascinating. It's not everybody's cup of tea. It's not very glamorous, but actually, as a kind of window on the rest of the world, that for me makes places, trading estuaries like the Thames, really special.
Definitely. I mean, how unique it is to have that kind of industrial backdrop, but yet the wildlife is still there if you sort of take the time to stop and have a look for it as well.
Yeah, and the fact that we're now beginning to understand rather more about how we can make it even better. A lot of work over the last 20 years in just refining the detail of some of those river edge structures, so that it's no longer just a happy accident if the plants and the fish fry and the other things manage to hang on there. We can design them in ways which make sure that they're very receptive. And on a bigger scale, really exciting developments further downstream, where there are new mudflats and new areas of salt marsh being created at a time when around most of the coast those things are disappearing. So we're actually seeing really quite a renaissance in the wildlife capacity of the estuary, not just the quality of the water, the cleanliness of it, the reduction in pollution, which you can't easily see, but actually an increasing amount of habitat, either carefully preserved or, more importantly, from my point of view, I think, recreated and restored.
I couldn't agree more. And I guess the more research that goes along with that, the more we're going to learn about it and be able to improve it as well.
Thames Estuary is a really important place for fish. I mean, it sounds ridiculous or obvious, but it is. And it's the outer estuary is probably the most significant commercial Dover sole fishery in Europe. So this isn't just tiddlers and, just interesting fish, but of no value. There is a real commercial value to the fish in the Thames. But what I certainly hadn't understood was that many of the species that live in the Thames migrate between the freshwater and the saltwater. So they may be spawned out on the sandbanks out in the outer estuary. They'll then travel as tiny little fish fry into the salt marsh creeks around the coast of Essex and Kent. But then they have to travel up to the freshwater, all the way up to Teddington. And then, most of them are smaller than a postage stamp when they're trying to do this. So the only way they can migrate up the river is by surfing up on the tide. They travel up on the tide, and then they have to find somewhere to hang on when the tide goes out again. And the place they hang on is in those tiny little bits of vegetation and the small puddles in the mud that seem so insignificant. But without them, the fish actually can't survive in the estuary. And one of the things that's been exciting, I think, is seeing how once you understand that, you can make those minor adaptations to the river walls. And instead of making them as smooth and streamlined as possible, making them as rough as possible means that they then become stepping stones for the fish that are migrating up and down the river. And that's all kind of happening invisibly. You would never know that unless you were with somebody who could explain it. or if you went down at low tide and looked in some of the puddles in June, July, the little puddles that are behind the odd rock or whatever, and you find that they're absolutely teeming with tiny little fish fry. So migration works in the Thames Estuary at a whole range of different levels. And that aspect of it I'd never thought about until I started to meet people through the Thames Estuary Partnership who were passionate about fish. And if you've got the fish populations growing, then inevitably you'll see more herons, you'll see more kingfishers, you'll see more cormorants, you'll see more seals. So the fish are very low down in the food chain, but critically important.
Definitely. And there's some incredible species linked to the Thames. Like, I was recently reading a paper, you were saying about sole and place and how they migrate up the Thames, sort of surfing on the wind and the currents. I mean, that's just incredible.
They really are tiny. And what I would love to see is more of a link between the fish in the river and the fish in the restaurants. The restaurants should be telling the story about fish migration in the Thames. And I think that's, again, the kind of thing that changes the learning process for people. It's all very well having, an exhibition in the Natural History Museum about fish fry migration, but the only people who are going to go there are kids who are dragged there, whether they like it or not, or people who are already passionate about fish fry. But if you have, a diagram of that on the back of the menu in top restaurants, then you're beginning to see a quite different kind of level of communication. Migration is a fascinating aspect of the Thames because it's kind of invisible, but it's a global issue. Just thinking about, if you think of a map of Great Britain, down in the bottom right-hand corner of the map, there is this great funnel, which is the Thames Estuary. And that funnel is absolutely connecting London and the rest of the country with far-flung corners of the globe. So in the winter, there are hundreds of thousands of birds that are coming all the way from Siberia and northern Scandinavia, down through the North Sea, and then entering the estuary. And some of them will spend the winter there. But many of the other birds, the non-water birds, things like fieldfares and redwings, will be traveling that same journey, but then carrying on up the river. And they may even finish up in Wolverhampton, which is one of the things that thrills me about all of this. In the spring, what we've got is a different lot of birds. So in April, you've got the swallows, for instance, which are still a feature of the wider countryside, although they've declined dramatically. But looking at the swallows flying low over the pasture and amongst the cows in the fields, you would never, ever imagine that they'd spent half of the year down on the southern tip of Africa and that they've made that journey. And as I'm sure you know, for until really quite recently in historical terms, people assumed that when swallows disappeared at the end of the summer, they went down into the mud in the bottom of ponds. That seemed a much more realistic proposition than, no, they fly all the way to southern Africa, across the Sahara and all the way down through the Congo and beyond. But that's what they do. So the Thames Estuary is a kind of a point of entry and exit for world travellers. That's fantastically exciting. And the British Isles is the kind of terminus for many, many more of those migrant birds than most other places in Europe. So we're a very key part of that whole system. In the spring, as I say, the swallows and the swifts come in May, but before them, all of those songbirds, the warblers, the willow warblers and the chiffchaffs and the blackcaps that are also coming from the Mediterranean area or beyond, and the nightingales that we're lucky enough to have, certainly in Essex and Kent still, coming from the centre of Africa and finishing up, in the middle of Thurrock, or extraordinary connections. The other thing which I think people don't realise is that some of those birds will migrate during the day. So swallows, for instance, feed on the wing, So they fly during the daytime and they're eating insects as they fly, and that's what keeps them going all the way across the Sahara and this huge journey. But they then roost at night. And so the reed beds at the mouth of the Thames are probably the first place that they settle once they've crossed the channel. Other species, like the fieldfares and the redwings that I get in my garden or 200 miles north, fly at night. And if you stand, particularly now there is so little traffic at night, you listen very carefully, you can quite often hear flocks of those birds that have flown down from Norway and are flying down the channel, turning right and flying up the Thames Estuary. And you can hear them calling to one another. And they're navigating, we think anyway, partly by following the dark corridor that is the Thames. And, this whole business of how migration works is still a mystery, but there isn't any doubt that I think something as powerful in the map as the Thames Estuary must be a really key guide for many, many of those airborne species anyway.
I mean, it is incredible. The Thames Estuary is one of the UK's most internationally important waterbird sites.
Yeah.
But there's over the years there have been threats to that, haven't there? I mean, the airport being a major one, the airport that they were going to build on the Thames, on a water, on this incredibly important site where waterbirds migrate to.
And had that been built, it wouldn't have just been the destruction of the habitat that its footprint went on. But of course, as soon as you start to run an airport from there, there are all kinds of pressures to make sure that large flocks of birds aren't flying into the engines of the planes. And so there'd be, a whole kind of collateral damage to the bird populations too. So great success for conservation that didn't happen. An early one of Boris's ideas, I think that was probably. There is a constant pressure, of course there is. But one of the really satisfactory things that's been happening is that because I think Thames Estuary Partnership and others have managed to build a better conversation between different players. There's a really good example of this down at Dubai Ports, which is this enormous container port down on the old Shell site down in Thurrock. That inevitably was built on really quite valuable wildlife habitats. A lot of work went into moving great crested newts and all the stuff that generally goes on, but much more significantly, by working with, in that case, the RSPB, that whole development has also generated a big new area of salt marsh and mudflats, which has now got avocets on it that were never there before. So I think we are learning how we can collaborate, how we can work in partnership. And to do that, you need brokers. And the Thames Estuary Partnership is a broker that can bring together strange bedfellows, so the scientists of London Zoo working along with the shipping companies that run container ports and the conservation organisations like the RSPB and the Port of London Authority, all these different players. That is pretty unique, I think.
So as well as birds then and fish, tell me what else really uses the Thames for their migration travels?
One of the real surprises for people is that moths and butterflies, tiny little things really, will fly 1,000 miles just to feed on the nectar in a park in London. They'll have come from southern Spain or North Africa. And some years, last year, 2019, was a particularly good year for painted ladies. Hundreds of thousands, millions of painted lady butterflies flying in great clouds up the Thames Estuary and then on into the rest of the country. And there are a lot of moths that, again, very unglamorous part of the wildlife spectrum, but nevertheless fascinating in their own way, and they will migrate. So I get in my garden hummingbird hawk moths in the summer, fascinating day-flying moths, but they migrate from northern Africa and southern Spain. So it's not just big flocks of birds, it's not just the songbirds that arrive for the summer or the waders that arrive for the winter. Many, many other species are on the move. One of the things that surprises people is that birds they thought were their blackbird or their robin in their garden are actually not just a single bird, that a lot of those common garden birds will migrate quite long distances So a lot of the blackbirds that we have in our gardens in the winter will have come across the channel as the weather got colder and colder in Denmark and the Netherlands. They will fly over here along with a lot of other species. I had a great job a couple of years ago advising for the Christmas film, the advertising film for Waitrose.
Okay.
Not the kind of gig most people get. You know, there's this great competition every winter for John Lewis. What's John Lewis going to do in Marks and Spencer's, and is it going to be a bouncing dog on this year or whatever it is? No, that year Waitrose chose to tell the story of a robin that was migrating from northern Norway, took a lift on a fishing boat, and eventually finished up inevitably eating a Waitrose mince pie on a bird table in the garden.
Well, of course, yeah.
But that was fascinating because, you know, who knew, kind of thing, that the robins that we think are there the whole year round are actually also migrating. And again, the Thames Estuary is the route for many of them. The more you learn about migration, the less you understand it, really. It's a major feature, particularly of wildlife in the British Isles. And it's a really powerful role that the Thames Estuary plays that benefits many, many people way beyond London. It's
so interesting because, like you were saying, when I think of migration in the Thames Estuary, I instantly think of birds. Maybe I'm biased as a keen twitcher myself, but you do instantly think of birds. But it's not just birds, it's this, you know, huge plethora of other species that are using the Thames for their migration. It's incredible.
Well, and also there's this wonderful thing that happens as well, even within the Thames Estuary. In the winter, you will know as a twitcher that there will be lots of curlews, for instance, out on the mudflats, and oyster catchers and other wading birds. Now, some of those will have arrived from the continent, but a lot of them will have flown down from the Brecon Beacons, or, you know, the uplands of Britain. So the curlew is a great example, I think, that it's thought of. If you grew up where I grew up in Sheffield on the edge of the Peak District, the curlew for me was the sound of summer walking through the moorland, and that would be true for anybody who's rambled in the summer through the national parks. Sadly, increasingly difficult to hear. But if you live on the estuary, then the call of the curlew is a winter call, and these are the same birds. They nest up in the moorland and in the pasture up on the hills, but then they travel down for the winter to the mudflats, partly because the food supply is so much more accessible in the winter there. And the same applies to kingfishers. Kingfishers, many of them will migrate from the rivers and the canals in inland Britain down to the estuaries because the water doesn't freeze there. And if you're a kingfisher, then, you know, a bit of a challenge if you have frozen water to dive through, but you can be pretty certain that in the creeks on the salt marsh, there will be open water to fish in. So there are all kinds of different levels of migration, and that really is what makes the landscape generally fascinating, but estuaries absolutely central, I think, to nature conservation.
I don't like bringing this up, but I feel we have to touch on the threat of climate change. I mean, what's your kind of thoughts on how climate change will affect species migration in relation to the Thames?
Undoubtedly, it will have an impact. That's the first thing to say. And it already is having an impact. If climate change leads to greater desertification in Africa, then the journey of the swallows will be tougher and tougher and tougher. That great gap they have to cross will get wider. So that's one example where I think climate change is going to have a bearing. Looking at the other end of migration, if we start to get the permafrost up in the Arctic zone melting, that landscape will change very quickly. It will become more wooded, I guess, and that will have an impact on some of those wading birds that we see in the winter here, but that are ground nesting birds in the frozen north. So there are those kinds of impacts. But I think there are also really quite interesting opportunities too. There's no question, it seems to me, that we're going to have to come to terms with rising sea levels and probably more extreme weather patterns and greater tidal surges. Now, a place like the Thames Estuary is very vulnerable to all of that. The wealth of London is largely at or below sea level. So you don't have to be a genius to see that if the sea level is rising, that's a serious threat. And as a nation, we spend many, many millions of pounds on raising the sea defences and keeping the sea out. But one of the changes in the last 20 years, I suppose, has been a rediscovery in a way that actually there are other ways of taking the energy out of rising sea levels and the threat of flooding, not by trying to kind of hold it back, but by taking the energy out of it by allowing the landscape, the margin between the sea and the land, to absorb it. Really good examples in Essex and in Kent of removing the sea defences that have been there for a couple of hundred years, letting the sea back in to agricultural land, restoring the salt marsh and the creek systems, so that then when you get a storm battering the coast, there isn't that moment when it overtops the defences. It's the landscape absorbing that pressure. And those are the same landscapes that are also fostering the fish fry and supporting the bird life and maintaining populations of coastal wildflowers. So I think we are beginning to see a softening of the defences against that aspect of climate change. We've spent most of my lifetime paving over towns and cities so that the rainwater runs off as fast as possible. Well, that causes problems. It's why we're spending £4.5 billion on this huge super sewer, not so much to cope with the sewage, but to cope with the stormwater that is overloading the sewers and causing pollution problems. Now, if you can make as many places as possible across the city more absorbent, softer, greener, then when you get the torrential downpours that we're going to have increasing numbers of through climate change, if you can make that rainwater, allow that rainwater to soak in rather than run off, then you'll reduce the problems that arise from flash flooding and all the problems that come with that. But you can do that and at the same time create new wetlands, create interesting landscapes full of nature. So I think I hope we're going to see that climate change is going to prompt some really much more imaginative thinking. And to do that, you then need partnerships between the engineers, the naturalists, the scientists, the developers, the local authorities, all these different people and organisations that have a part to play in making the changes.
It's certainly going to take a real collaboration of sectors in order to sort of come against climate change, isn't it? And the issues that you just raised there.
Yeah, and partners that we've never really thought about. I mean, the insurance industry, apart from Poole in Dorset, London is the centre of the British insurance industry, and they ought to be a part of that conversation. Because actually, if we can find a gentler way of dealing with torrential downpours than just filling people's living rooms with flood water, then that is clearly a benefit to them and all of their clients. And it's obviously a benefit to the people who would otherwise get flooded. And if you can say, well, in the process, we can increase the opportunities for dragonflies and frogs and newts, for songbirds and a whole range of other things, and for kids to have access to fishing tadpoles in the spring, all of that can begin to deliver a much more interesting landscape, which is also more robust, more able to cope with change.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like, that's a real role where the catchment-based approach could come in, bringing all these stakeholders together from so many different sectors and, focus on these topics, break it down into smaller chunks and work together on it. Finally, I'm going to ask you, for anybody that's interested out there, can you suggest some sort of key species to look for at certain times of the year? So perhaps now, being spring? In
the spring, I think you need to keep an eye out in the sky as much as anything for the birds that are travelling up the estuary. This is the time when the big dramatic flocks of winter birds have left. And so I always think that spring is a time for listening rather than looking, in a way. And many of the best of the singers in the dawn chorus in our parks and gardens will actually have migrated here. And so there's a kind of dimension to wildlife at this time of year, which you hear rather than see. Something I started 30 odd years ago was International Dawn Chorus Day, which is now first Sunday in May. Last year, for instance, I was involved with a radio program made by the Irish radio station RTE, which was 8 hours long, which sounds like a nightmare. Started at midnight our time in India and traveled through 26 different countries with an ornithologist just waking up with the birds and describing the sound. And, it's the sounds of the bird song. And International Dawn Chorus Day is a morning when lots of people just get up and share the experience. So I would say in the spring, it's about listening, and it's about the invisible, really, the hidden wildlife. In the winter or in the autumn, certainly, I think if you can get out to the outer reaches of the estuary, then you will see absolutely spectacular sights. And if we're ever allowed to travel on riverboats again at the end of this extraordinary spring that we're in, then I think people should, once in their life, should try and get down the estuary far enough to see seals pulled out on the sandbanks. And if you're really lucky, just keeping your eyes open right in the heart of the city to see whether you can spot one of those harbour porpoises that is living below the surface but thriving in inner city London because the fish are there.
Chris, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to be talking to you, especially about such a great subject. So thank you very much for your time.
It's a pleasure.
Now, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us for our first episode of Talk of the Thames. We certainly had a lot of fun doing it, and I really hope that you enjoyed listening to it. We will be releasing a new episode every month, so I hope very much to see you back here for our next one. In the meantime, if you would like any further information, please do visit the Thames Estuary Partnership website at www.thamesestuarypartnership.org. Take care and thank you.